Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Beck Rumbul. I'm Executive Director and CEO of the Rust Foundation. And yeah, we are hopefully going to have just a lovely chat about Rust in reality, using it in business, and where it's going in the future. Can I just ask my panelists to introduce themselves quickly?
Sure. I guess I'll go first. Everyone, my name is Chris Konstad. I'm a production engineer at Meta.
Hi, I'm Armin Ronacher. I work as principal architect at Sentry, which is a crash reporting application monitoring company.
Hi, I'm Florian. I'm managing director and co-founder of Ferrous Systems.
And I'm Luca Palmieri, and I'm a senior engineer at AWS.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining me today. So I think, Florian, if we can kick off with you, Rust is an amazing language, and you have made a business out of it. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So I think one of my favorite papers about programming languages is if you want to make a business out of it, no one adopts programming languages for features. It's the hard truth, but because they have a need. And the one thing that I found that I see is the reason of the success and the business success in Rust is because it comes at a point where a lot of companies are rethinking the tooling stack. Everything becomes faster, everything becomes connected. The area where I'm currently in, automotive companies need to think about, we can't do the 5-year development cycle anymore because suddenly our cars are connected to the internet. We need to crash patch, like all of these kind of things. And Rust makes an offer for both convenient to use programming languages with stability guarantees that you would usually find in the functional space. And that's the direction that the view is going. We need new tools, and then tools are selected rather than constantly wanting to replace tools and just do better and fun things. The last thing I have to say, though, sometimes companies are interested in just doing fun things. I have trained companies that just wanted to give their programmers a gift, and I can tell you that's very enjoyable.
So, I mean, that's really interesting. But you're a Rust project veteran. You were ahead of that very steep learning curve we all hear about. But some businesses, are having to make the decision: are we going to invest in Rust? Are we going to use it? How are we going to do that? Luca, you gave a really great presentation a couple of weeks ago that I was part of, talking about how the organization you were working for at the time kind of started off that process. How did that go?
Yeah, sure. So for context, my previous company was 100 developers, 150 developers, originally a C# shop, so a lot of investment into the C# ecosystem. And we started adopting Rust a couple of years back, so we're looking at 2020, end of 2019, and at the end of 2022, that was ramped up to 40, 50 Rust developers, so almost half of the development force. Oh, Jesus. The choice for us, as Florian was saying, like you come at a language with a need, and some of those needs are technical, and some of those needs are more social, if you want. We came at Rust from a technical perspective because we needed better domain modeling. So we needed algebraic types, we needed to handle nullability, we needed to handle the possibility of failures in a way that was more manageable than exceptions. At the same time, we needed to hire certain types of developers that we were not finding in the C# community, but instead we were actually finding very easily in the Rust community. But at the same time, we had obstacles. So it was a very new ecosystem, so there were not a lot of Rust developers, as in people with production experience using the language. But there were a lot of people aspiring to be Rust developers. So people have been doing it for hobby and wanted to get a job. And so at that point in time for us, training, for example, was a bottleneck. And Florian was on site for us doing training. And we did a lot of internal training, so people using Rust to people wanting to use the language. And it was a very successful experience. It was not easy to get started. Like at the beginning of 2020, our use case was backend development, so web. I think a way that had been stabilized in November 2019, so it was very fresh. The ecosystem was going through multiple, waves of churn of various kind. But it was enough to prove it on a business case, in our case, a banking ledger. So a fairly, safety critical, well, not in the definition of safety critical you would use, but Safety in the sense of, if we make some mistake, this can cost us several millions of pounds, depending on the kind of mistake that we make. And so correctness there was valued enough for us to make a bet to try something new. And then we found out that actually it wasn't that much more difficult to write than what we were using before. And so from there, kind of spread through simply developers in the company knowing that it was a golden pathway which was supported and choosing to use it and kind of iterating over that. So that was a little bit the process.
Thanks, Luca. And Armin, how was the process at Sentry.io?
Yeah, I think for us it was mostly, so when we started, we were a Python shop, so we did most of the, in fact, the entire implementation of all of Sentry was all in Python. And I was playing around with Rust already for a while, just as an interesting hobby project because I found it interesting. And at one point we actually figured out that one of the sort of hobby implementations of the source map processing that I did in Rust was actually outperforming the production Python one. And because Rust was already at the time very trivial to use as an extension to Python, so you could call into Rust code very trivially from Python, we sort of had an obvious way to put it in. And the results were very promising from a performance perspective. And then at the same time, we also had a small little utility, a command line tool. And if you've ever used Python, the distribution of command line utilities to customers with Python is very tricky. And so Rust was supposed to do the same thing as the server is already doing. So we had some use to reuse the code between the command line client and the server. And so we sort of started slipping into this. And over the next couple of years, I think we had just more and more Rust code appear naturally in the code base. And I think we have probably like almost 7 years of Rust at Sentry in one form or another. And because we already had started building some of our processing pipeline in Rust over the years, just started accumulating more and more. And the initial benefits was almost entirely performance. But one of the core critical components of Sentry is that we process native stack traces. So when you have a crash coming from an iOS device or an NDK device, or just plain C++, you need to process the debug information files. And a lot of the historic tools in this space are actually intended to be run on trusted data. So you would have your own debugger running locally and you kind of trust your own compiler to not create nonsense. But if you process debug symbols from customers, you kind of are always exposed to this inherent risk that this is doing something it's not supposed to do. And the Rust ecosystem started building more and more of these tools around to actually process debug information files. And we were able also to contribute back into this. And we are very happy now that I think I'm pretty sure as of today, with the exception of a tiny component, all of the symbol and debug processing is actually fully running on Rust. So we replaced the entirety of the C++ code base that we used for this before. And I think it worked out really well in terms of how it actually functions in the company. It's very fun to work on, I would say. And it's also easy for us comparatively to make people excited to work on this code base. That wasn't the case with C++ before.
So Chris, Meta is a behemoth. It's a huge company. Was the journey of getting Rust in and starting to use it similar, or was that a different proposition?
It was a long-running process that took many years. So first, the source code management team looked at adopting Rust in about 2016. Engineers at Meta have a lot of flexibility in choosing the tools that they use to get the job done, including choosing the language that's used. That being said, there's a few officially blessed languages, and if you stick down that route, it is easier to get work done, and it is easier to you don't get pushback from people saying why are you using this random language that just came out. But anyways, so we were looking at doing some work in Mercurial, and there's a bunch of Python engineers and moving from Python to something more performant, and so the default option for that would be C++. And one of the engineers at the time didn't like the idea of trying to onboard a bunch of Python-first engineers into the very complex C++ language. And everything at Meta is networked and concurrent and async and all that stuff. So it's a tall order to go from nothing to that in C++. And this is before coroutines, right? And so they started looking around at Rust and started importing Rust, and that worked out really well. So later on, like other teams kind of started piggybacking off their work. So they had to like integrate the Rust compiler with our build tooling and all that kind of stuff. So once that work was done, other teams kind of started hopping on, and it was kind of like watching a forest fire. You get all these little sparks and these little fires all over the place. And then eventually, like, you know, you can't, it's hard to find a team that's not interested or already starting to use Rust. It's absolutely everywhere. We have a boot camp process. So when you join the company, you go through this like technical, all these technical classes, and then you go sit around with different teams and try to find which team you want to join, and that's how you decide which team you go on. And while you're sitting there doing your classes, you can get tasks from real teams and do real production work that are like bite-sized little bits. And that's one of the ways that we kind of help onboard people onto Rust, is we have a lot of these little Rust-specific bootcamp tasks that people can try out. And honestly, like for us, for my team, like using Rust has been a benefit in hiring people onto the team. New people come into the company and come out of bootcamp, and they say, "I want a team that does Rust." And so that's been super helpful too. There's a bunch of latent demand out there.
So is Rust now a blessed language in Meta?
Oh, I should have said that too. Rust is now officially a blessed language.
It is, yeah, that's really exciting. So a few of you have actually spoken about hiring. We've seen recently that this year Rust was like the most wanted language, not just the most loved, in the Stack Overflow survey. This is kind of speaking to a demand for Rust developers. Is that something that you're finding easy to recruit for? Is it difficult? Are there gaps in the market? I don't know. Do you want to go first, Chris? Okay.
Yeah, I'll go first. It's been, I think, relatively, like I said earlier, like there's been a lot of demand of people that want Rust team. They want Rust exposure. Some come with experience, some don't. So it's been like easier for teams that have this Rust exposure to like hire out of bootcamp. So for us, it's from my experience, it's been a pure win. We'll have new people come into the company and be like, I want Rust specifically. Don't show me any team that doesn't do that. So that's a competitive advantage, because it can be kind of competitive trying to get the top engineers out of bootcamp from other teams that also want them.
Florian, you go in and train huge teams, right?
Yeah, if I can tune the question a little, we have no problem hiring Rust engineers with our profile. But I think there's an interesting conversation going on about this, because we're both getting questions from clients and potential clients about, can we find Rust engineers? And I think there's still a huge pool of people that would actually like to switch a job to one where they can do more Rust. That's the one side. And the other thing is, from when I talk to programmers, they say like there's not many job postings out there for Rust. And I think one of the things that we're seeing there, we are currently retraining cohorts of teams into Rust. And I think that's if you look at it closely, a very reasonable process. Companies don't adopt new languages by hiring new developers with new language on a new team. That's at least one new too much. So the usual thing they do is they retrain an internal team that they trust to execute something, try a small project, try 2 small projects, grow the project, and then at some point they're starting to hire new Rust people into the team. Because the most important bit at the beginning is that you have developers that have the context, that know the requirements, that know how the company works, and that trust the management to also say, hey, by the way, this project is going well, or it is going not as well as you'd expected. For a new developer, that probably is a bad position to be in, saying, hey, by the way, you picked this language, and I now have to tell you that thing isn't going as well. So there's all these kinds of dynamics going on, and it has been our experience in the last 1 to 2 years that we're working with large enterprises, retraining whole teams in the hundreds into Rust.
Luca, you gave a knowing smile there.
No, it's absolutely true. We did the same thing. Like, you don't throw a new project in a new language to new people. Like, you usually start with some internal people, you get them to do it. Also because it's a matter of trust, right? Like, if you move existing team members into using a new language and the new language doesn't work out, they're still part of your company. If you are a bunch of people and you say, we're going to do Rust, what happens if the project doesn't work out? And so you don't want to be in that situation, nor you as a company, nor them. They join, believing that we're going to use a certain technology to find out 2 months afterwards that actually was very fun, but it doesn't fit our requirements.
Armin, how is it Sentry?
So for us, it's, I think, so first of all, I generally feel like more people that want to do Rust than we actually have Rust code at Sentry, because we have a lot of JavaScript still, we have a lot of Python, we have gazillions of SDKs in all kinds of languages. So I feel like we are now at this point where there is actually more sort of inbound demand for Rust position than we actually have available. And we also went down the same path. It's originally when we started the whole thing that we're not really Rust programmers. So every single person that joined up to a certain point probably learned Rust at the company. So this internal retraining for sure is how we went down this. And yeah, generally it feels like there's a growing demand of people to actually find a place where they can do this. Yeah, I think it worked well for us. It was a hiring advantage for quite a while, because there was already sort of a demand of working on a Rust program, but there was not necessarily a commercial angle to it. So for us being one of the first, I think it was always a selling point.
So for individuals who are looking to get a job in Rust, in one of your companies maybe, what's your advice for those people? If it's more a case of at the moment you're training people internally to move into things, should they do personal projects? Are there things that they can do to bulk out their CVs to be attractive?
Shall I try to answer that? I think it really depends. Obviously, different companies have different hiring cultures. Like some people want experience with the language, other companies don't really care much. My personal suggestion is, once again, not to go for too many news. Like if you are applying for a position and that position is in a certain domain and requires Rust, for you to be, a candidate that is relevant to that position, either you need to know the language, you need to know the domain. If you don't know either, it becomes very difficult to step into that as the candidate position, especially for companies that are adopting Rust. At least that was our process in my previous place. We try to balance out, domain expert and language experts. So then you get a team that is somewhat capable to execute and they can mentor each other. And then you get a team that is actually full independent with all contributors capable of giving something to the product. Said that, then it really depends who you're applying to.
Armin?
So I ironically get a lot of questions about how to get Rust into a company already. One of the, I think, sort of to go with this a little bit is like, you probably already have a problem where Rust can fit in somewhat. So I come up from the Python community. Performance issues is a classical reason for people to look for solutions. And the Rust ecosystem is actually pretty strong in certain areas. For us, obviously, debug information file processing was a huge advantage. But there's a lot of utility in the Crates ecosystem. And if you really are in this mood that you want to try to see if you can introduce Rust in a company, maybe you actually have a performance issue where you can relatively trivially work with the existing ecosystem to see if you can demonstrate that this is something that actually can benefit. It's incredibly hard to build a new service in a new language with no prior experience. It sets you up for failure, but if you have something that you can already improve on by maybe moving bits and pieces out, I've seen people do this successfully.
Yeah, so on the question, if you're individually searching for a job, I can highly recommend two things. Headhunters aren't bad, and they're specialized Rust headhunters. If you want to switch to a Rust career, contact one of them. The second is, there's a danger of comparison. Probably everyone here on stage is a wrong comparison to compare yourself to for your skill in Rust. Rust is still a young language, and that brings the advantage of it's relatively easy to become an expert in any one of those things that Armin mentioned. Implement a protocol or something really well or something like that. It is currently doable with a reasonable amount of time to become an expert in a domain where in JavaScript, Java, or any one of the traditional very broad languages it isn't possible, and to point the light at you. And I think that's one of the reasons why don't compare to anyone else. Look for the niche where there's nothing yet and no one's doing it in Rust, and it can be a very easy 1 to 2 blog posts. It's still the point where with 1 to 2 blog posts you can set in a niche. Just to make it clear, Ferrous System needed 3 blog posts to be the experts in safety critical.
Power of writing.
That was very deliberate, and you can do that too.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, at Meta, as far as getting a Rust job in particular, you just got to get into through the interview process. So any programming language in the world will get you through that. And then landing on a team that has Rust, like you're gonna probably be, jockeying for position against people that maybe have Rust experience. And then, what if you don't like Rust? You should probably try it out first just to make sure you actually do like it. Because, there's a bit of a learning curve, and it's totally worth it. It's 100% worth the learning curve. I would do it again in a heartbeat. But it was, it's something that, might take a time or two to get past. And then once you're past it, it's great. But you might want to do that before trying to land on the team that you want to land on. So it's probably good to have some, experience ahead of time.
I feel like we should get T-shirts made up with "It's 100% worth the learning curve." So yeah, that's really encouraging. In terms of that you're going to run out of internal engineers to retrain in Rust though at some point. And the learning curve is something that I think everyone here has heard over and over and over again. Is there a point at which we should be, more actively trying to educate people in Rust that they don't have to go through 3 or 4 languages first to get to Rust?
If I can grab that one, I have a lot of opinions on that.
I thought you might.
So, first of all, I've been training Rust since 2015, and the first thing is the learning curve has flattened, both in education experience, in code out there. There's much more code examples that are really good and rather easy to use. It's the interesting thing about programming languages. For the first couple of years, the programming language community itself needs to figure out how it works and how it's easy. And that's been the phase from 2015 to 2018, something like that. The other thing is there's no pre-requirement to learn any languages before Rust. It is actually a problem that previous knowledge in programming languages interferes with learning new languages. That's the thing that trainers do. Teach you the subject without interference with other subjects. And that's, so there's no, you need to be this tall to learn Rust. That needs to be understood both from companies and also by individuals. The hardest groups to train are people who believe that they are done with systems programming and they know it all. Because you need to tell them that, yes, they know it all, but they can do it in another language as well. And the last bit is, it is often overstated how much the programming language matters in our trade. There's so much more knowledge, how the hardware works, how protocols in the space works, how the environment works, codes, names, protocols, all of these kind of things. And Rust doesn't do away with all of that.
I think one of the interesting parts about Rust is that as hard as the language is, I think particularly for newcomers who have never done programming before, Rust is actually, I think, an interesting first language to pick up because the tooling around it is really good. I have done Python courses in the past where I was trying to teach it to people, and you basically spent the first 50% of your getting started, because someone has a Windows PC where they have a different version of Python that doesn't do anything. Then there's Anaconda. There's they somehow broke their local pip or whatever. And I've never had this problem that I showed someone Rust and it wouldn't work immediately. That I can check out a random example program and it typically works. And I think this is a huge advantage because it takes away this whole frustration before you can even get started learning something. But the frustration comes if you're already used to something and then it doesn't work anymore. Like particularly if you come from a language like C or C++, where you grow up with this idea that you can do anything for as long as you can touch the memory, it just doesn't work like that in Rust. It will prevent you, and if you're really trying to sort of get this pattern that you're already used to working in Rust, you just keep running into walls. A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post about like the best way to program Rust is to learn which things you can't do. And this is I still get email responses to that particular blog post, because for a lot of people, this sort of is their experience if they come from another language. It's like they're trying to do this, and then only after they learn somewhere on the internet that you can never do that, they stop trying, and then the mind moves on, and you can actually do the things that do work.
I think another data point there is that there are learning curves, I think, for Rust. Like a lot of people get scared by the surface of the language. Like Rust is a big language, there's a lot of things in there. But in reality, depending on what you're trying to do, you only need a small subset of those things. Like there are certain parts of the language which I've never touched because, for example, I never did CFFI. Like I don't need it. I've been doing Rust professionally for 3 years. I consider myself decent. And I live happily. Like a lot of people go to Rust saying, now I need to learn all those things. And there's a lot to learn, but it's actually not necessary. And I think we are seeing that different subset of the ecosystems, as Florian was saying, are evolving, their own learning curves, they're evolving their own resources and their own ramps to doing web, to doing games, to doing embedded, whatever that is. And as those resources, accumulate and those ecosystems stabilize, code examples are going to go out, and it's going to get increasingly easier and easier and easier. And, frameworks are going to get more complete and so on and so forth. Which goes back to what Florian was saying, like there's a lot of space to do things. One way is looking at things that are underserved. Another way is looking at projects from, 5 years ago that are unmaintained and just refreshing them, and fixing them. But you don't have to know it all. Like you can get productive in a short amount of time if you are comfortable not knowing everything. Like just moving, with the things that you need to do, and you get a compiler error, it tells you stuff you don't understand, you look it up, you keep doing stuff, and iterate. And eventually you'll get to know a lot of the dusty corners, and you'll consider yourself knowledgeable, but that's not necessary. Like it's nice because you feel competent when you know all the things. But it's not needed to do things. I think that is one of the myths that needs to be a little bit debunked about learning Rust.
Yeah, kind of hopping onto that. I've been writing Rust code professionally since 2019, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've had to use like explicit lifetimes. Like clone carries you really far, and you probably don't need to worry about it. And like, I love that when I'm writing Rust, that clone sticks out, so that way you don't accidentally copy too many times. But it kills me when I watch people trying to learn Rust for the first time and they're getting caught up on lifetimes and trying to avoid that one clone that happens in main once. And you're like, it doesn't matter. Just clone it. It's fine. You'll be okay. So, don't sweat that stuff, right? The documentation is amazing. The book is great. The amount of blog posts that have already been written and will be written in the future is amazing. And, the compiler errors, I come from C++. Yeah, anyone from C++ will tell you, you get one character wrong and your compiler error is just this inscrutable 40-page output that you can't even find the line that caused the error, even if you wanted to. It's a skill to develop how to debug those issues. And the Rust compiler error, those messages are incredible. It's a great teacher. It really, someone once described it as a senior engineer pair programming with you and telling you what you did wrong. And it truly is like that. It's just a great overall experience.
So Rust is great.
Bias panel, bias.
We could just go home. There's got to be challenges, though. What do you see as kind of the biggest challenges in terms of increasing use of Rust adoption? I don't know who wants to. Luca, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's go in. I have a list. So as Florian was saying, the learning curve flattened. But in reality, when you wander in some corners, then it gets, very curly. It can get recursive. Asynchronous code can get quite nasty when it comes, for example, to compiler errors and, getting to do certain things. It's very easy, to start from something that looks innocent, and then you kind of step in the wrong way, and then you're off a cliff, and you're like, oh my God, rescue me. So there's that. There's challenges in the ecosystem. Obviously, when you write software commercially, like the ideal way is you write it once, you can get updates forever, and it's going to run without any problems. That's the dream. In reality, being a young ecosystem, there's a lot of churn in certain parts of the ecosystem. And what that means is that you require more maintenance that perhaps you would require if you were using, ASP.NET Core, which more or less hasn't changed much in the last few years. Other challenges, I think, will just be getting more companies to use it, and that requires getting more experienced Rust developers on the market, but requires also a general, getting consulting companies which are able to do, for example, staff augmentation. That was a thing when we were using it at TrueLayer. We were like, we need a few extra devs because we need to get this project done on these dates. And really, there wasn't much on the market if you wanted to get someone to come at your company and help you build that project, unless you wanted to train them. But at that point, why are you bringing them? And, that kind of doesn't work out. So those are some of the challenges, and obviously scaling the project, I think, is going to be difficult when the community size increases and the number of contributors increases, and managing, keeping the language learnable while trying to satisfy more use cases. Probably there are better people than me to talk about the project.
That's loaded.
It's good. Yeah. So from my perspective, what's currently needed, one of the situations I'm very often in is, obviously, I talk to clients, to a set of clients, and about a lot of things, what the intentions are, but the problem is that message doesn't just stop there. Everyone's under NDA, and sometimes even at this conference, you're in conversations where 3 people are at a table and are talking vaguely about areas and places where people could use maybe Rust on maybe that platform. It's sometimes like absurd theater. And the solution for that is simple. If you're using Rust, talk about it. If you have a manager that does not know whether someone else is using Rust, try to find someone who's willing to talk about it. Because all of these companies and organizations are in a situation where they're looking left and right, and they're thinking there could be something in the room, but they're not quite sure yet. And that's a huge problem that we currently have in our industry. Rust is also kind of like a silent language. I'm culturally from the Ruby space, and in Ruby there's the joke that even companies that don't say they use Ruby somewhere have a huge Ruby stack somewhere in their ops department. Something like Chef or Puppet. But they're not using Ruby. And we're in a similar situation. You have a lot of companies that are effectively using Rust somewhere. You won't find it on their page or something else. So it's important that we have spaces, this conference, maybe more specialized conferences, events, meetups, where people can actively say, hey, by the way, I'm from company ABC. We're having a Rust department there, because that builds trust. And the gold standard would be blog about it, write about it with whomever, and have that conversation more out in the open, because I can say a lot on this stage on where Rust is being used. You can trust me or not. That's, to be honest, not a position I want to be in. I would rather be in a position where everyone gets the same information from the same sources that are public. And so if you're using Rust somewhere in your company, encourage your company to talk about that they're using Rust. I think that would be a huge boost.
So I think I'm coming from a little bit of a different angle, which is that I don't actually care if people use it commercially, but I do know that people do. And I see 2 challenges at the moment a little bit in this. One is that we have a very visible public ecosystem of open source software, and that is running one direction. And then you have companies that often are constrained in some form or another, and they are not as visible as the open source projects are. And I think this is a little bit of a problem at the moment, because, for instance, we are right now sort of, I think, in the 6th month of a secret sort of reshifting of the Rust ecosystem, where a lot of projects are trying to move up the minimum supported Rust version. And that's very fine in the open source ecosystem, but there's sort of a very well hidden commercial base that can't move the compiler as often as the rest of the ecosystem does. And I think this is a little bit of a problem that we don't really talk about much, that sort of there's no rule. There was sort of a hidden rule the last couple of years that a lot of projects are very conservative. All of a sudden, everybody's moving up. I feel like this is something that probably needs to be discussed in one form or another. And the other thing that I think is still a problem for commercial use of Rust is actually compile times still are not ideal. Or at the very least, it's still super easy to build a massive crate with a lot of dependencies and everything else. And quite a few people go down this path of building this massive crate and then have the problem splitting up later. The support for split crates is still not ideal. So I think as projects are growing and getting larger and larger in Rust, this is probably going to haunt us a little bit.
Similar or different challenges?
Yeah, I mean, definitely all those challenges like the churn in the environments, compile times for sure are a huge problem. And also like being able to integrate with other languages is super important, right? Like if you're like a larger company and you want to adopt Rust, you're not adopting it on these isolated greenfield projects, or you'd like to, but you don't always have a bunch of those, and you'll have to integrate with existing C++ libraries. You'll have to become a Python library, or integrate with these other languages. And so having solid support for that is pretty important. I mean, it's really easy to write like a Python a Rust library that Python can call into, for instance, and that's been absolutely huge for adoption within Meta.
Very last word, any kind of quick advice for businesses or individuals within businesses that are wanting to do more in Rust?
Okay, that's a tough question. Like, general, my suggestion would be to start small and start off the critical path. Like, play with the language, do some CLIs, do some build tooling, do something that it's not going to break your business if it goes sour. And then if you like it, build on top from there. If you don't like it, just stop and try again in a couple of years. As simple as that.
So from my perspective, it's incredibly important to be honest about, do we actually have a problem that Rust solves? We've seen that fail, but it's also, there's a lot of things that Rust solve at businesses. And if you have the hunch that Rust could be a solution, the moment to look into it and to start with it is now.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with this. One other thing that if you have a company that wants to play around with Rust that really doesn't have a use case is it's actually quite useful to have these sort of code jams or like blessed events where people can toy around with different things. And sometimes out of that comes something interesting. And particularly if you look at the advent of code, the number of people that actually choose to do it in Rust is pretty impressive. And I've seen this inside company hack events as well.
It can also be helpful to find other people in your company that are interested in Rust. There's probably more of them than you know, and you're probably all interested in working on the same stuff together.
Amazing. Luca, Florian, Armin, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the panel. I'm sure everyone else really appreciated it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.